From the first hours of this morning, an alarming pattern began to unfold across Russia's urban grid. In cities stretching from the Volga to the Urals, thousands of apartment blocks went cold simultaneously. Radiators stopped working, boiler stations stalled, and municipal dispatch lines collapsed under the weight of desperate calls. Official explanations were brief and contradictory: scheduled maintenance, temporary loss of pressure, seasonal adjustment. But according to internal reports circulating among regional administrations, the truth is far darker. The country's central heating network, one of the largest in the world, is failing in multiple regions at once. And for millions of Russians, this is no longer a technical malfunction, it's a national emergency unfolding in real time. By midday, the outages had reached Moscow's outer districts. Eyewitnesses described plumes of steam erupting from cracked pipes, whole streets engulfed in mist as aging infrastructure buckled under the first serious cold of the season. Municipal authorities urged calm, promising swift repairs. Yet energy engineers speaking to independent outlets admitted that spare parts are scarce and fuel reserves dangerously low. "We're running the system on inertia," one source from the Ministry of Housing said quietly. "Every hour that pressure drops, the grid weakens further." That confession, though unofficial, reflects what insiders have feared for months: the collapse of a network already crippled by sanctions, budget cuts, and the exodus of technical specialists. For years, the Kremlin projected an image of self-sufficiency, boasting that Russia's energy sector could withstand any foreign restriction. But today, that narrative is meeting its harshest test. Many of the components that keep heating systems running, valves, compressors, electronic regulators, were imported from European suppliers now out of reach. Local factories produce substitutes, yet their quality remains inconsistent, and repairs that once took hours now drag on for days. "We can't replace an entire ecosystem of expertise overnight," says one energy analyst in St. Petersburg. "The infrastructure is showing what the propaganda tried to hide: dependence." As reports of outages multiplied, the government ordered regional governors to avoid unnecessary statements and instructed state media to emphasize localized disruptions. But videos circulating on social networks tell another story: families sleeping in coats, hospitals using portable heaters, schools announcing technical breaks. In some towns, residents have begun burning trash or old furniture to survive the night. Officials describe this as temporary adaptation. Experts call it something else entirely: the first sign of systemic collapse. The paradox could not be starker. The nation that supplies gas to half of Europe cannot guarantee warmth to its own citizens. What was once the Kremlin's strongest symbol of power, energy, is turning into its greatest vulnerability. And as the temperature continues to fall, the pressure on the government, both literal and political, rises. Insiders say that emergency meetings are underway in Moscow, though no official has yet addressed the scale of the failure. The silence itself has become ominous. Because if the heating grid continues to fail, it won't just be pipes that burst, it will be the illusion of control that has held Russia together for decades. And that is what makes this crisis more than technical. It's existential. By early afternoon, the extent of the breakdown was becoming impossible to disguise. Internal dispatch logs from several regional power agencies, obtained by independent analysts, reveal that more than a third of Russia's centralized heating zones are now operating in critical mode. Entire districts have been disconnected to preserve what little pressure remains for hospitals and administrative buildings. In Yaroslavl, local authorities declared temporary restrictions, but witnesses describe entire neighborhoods dark and silent, with frozen water lines and thick frost crawling across apartment windows. In Nizhny Novgorod, residents report streets turned to sheets of ice as leaking pipelines burst beneath the pavements. The emergency crews sent to contain the damage work with outdated equipment, often improvising repairs with salvaged parts. "We are rebuilding a system that no longer exists," one technician admitted under condition of anonymity. Behind the scenes, the Kremlin has imposed a communications blackout on regional governors, forbidding them from acknowledging the word crisis. Instead, they are instructed to use softer language: pressure stabilization, localized imbalance, temporary technical delay. But within administrative channels, the tone is grim. According to an internal briefing seen by several energy analysts, the situation is deteriorating faster than projected. Key supply depots for thermal fuel oil and diesel have already been redirected toward military facilities, leaving municipal networks dependent on dwindling civilian reserves. In some regions, fuel shipments have been halted entirely due to logistical bottlenecks. One governor reportedly pleaded for assistance from the Ministry of Defense, requesting mobile boilers and generators, an unusual step that underscores how blurred the line between civilian and military infrastructure has become. What alarms insiders most is the simultaneity of the failures. Normally, heating disruptions occur sporadically, localized accidents caused by age or neglect. This time, they are happening everywhere at once. Experts believe the trigger was not just mechanical decay, but structural exhaustion. The heating grid operates on a delicate balance of pressure, temperature, and flow synchronization. When one region falters, others must compensate, drawing power and water from interconnected nodes. Now, as each node collapses, the entire network begins to destabilize, a domino effect no one can stop. Engineers have warned about this scenario for years, calling it the systemic threshold. It has now been crossed. Public frustration is mounting. In provincial towns, people have begun gathering outside local administration buildings, demanding explanations. State television ignores the images, but social networks tell a different story. Pensioners huddled around gas stoves, parents wrapping children in blankets beside unlit radiators, volunteers distributing firewood in the suburbs of Moscow itself. These are not scenes from remote villages, they are from the heart of the country's urban centers. The emotional impact is profound. For decades, the Kremlin's legitimacy rested on a simple contract: the state may demand obedience, but it will guarantee stability. That unspoken promise is now breaking apart with every frozen pipe. And yet, even as the scale of the catastrophe grows, the official narrative remains rigid. Federal channels broadcast images of repair brigades working heroically through the night, while government spokespeople assure citizens that all necessary measures have been taken. In truth, the measures are insufficient, and the government knows it. Quietly, ministries have begun to prepare for the possibility of large-scale evacuations if temperatures fall further. But evacuations would mean public acknowledgement of collapse, something the Kremlin is determined to avoid at any cost. The question that haunts officials tonight is not how to restore heat, but how to preserve authority once people realize that warmth, once guaranteed, is now a privilege of power. Because in Russia's current winter, the cold is no longer just weather, it is politics made visible. By mid-afternoon, the crisis had reached the capital's core. Reports from Moscow's western and southern districts confirmed what local officials tried to deny all morning: the city's centralized heating system was buckling under pressure. In Krylatskoye, apartment blocks stood silent, their radiators icy to the touch. In Lublino and Tsaritsino, residents filmed bursts of steam gushing from ruptured mains, the sound echoing through courtyards like distant artillery. The imagery was striking: a city built on the promise of power now engulfed in its own failures. Authorities quickly cordoned off the affected streets, but eyewitnesses noted that repair brigades appeared overwhelmed, working with outdated equipment and improvised tools. "We're not fixing the problem," one worker muttered to a bystander, "we're just slowing the collapse." Inside government offices, the atmosphere was tense and fractured. A confidential meeting held at the Ministry of Energy turned confrontational after regional representatives accused federal officials of withholding emergency funds. According to two sources familiar with the discussion, some cities have already exhausted their winter budgets, while others are operating on credit lines that may never be repaid. A senior ministry figure reportedly warned that the entire heating grid could enter irreversible phase failure if key components are not replaced within days, an impossible deadline given that most spare parts are now imported through back channels at triple the cost. Even within elite circles, the illusion of stability is wearing thin. "We've been pretending to control a system that no longer listens to us," one participant admitted privately. On the surface, Moscow still looks functional: lights are on, traffic moves, and the state channels repeat the same formulaic updates about restoration work in progress. But beneath that veneer, the city's arteries are freezing. Hospitals have been ordered to consolidate patients into wings with independent boilers. Schools close early for maintenance. In wealthier districts, private generators hum in courtyards while entire working-class neighborhoods shiver. The divide between those who can insulate themselves from the collapse and those who cannot is widening by the hour. And that contrast, visible, tangible, is what truly frightens the authorities. It turns technical failure into political metaphor, the warmth of privilege against the cold of neglect. Meanwhile, technical experts are beginning to suspect that the cascade of failures is not purely mechanical. The near-simultaneous pressure drops across multiple cities point to either deliberate manipulation or systemic overload caused by mismanagement at the control hubs. Several independent engineers interviewed by foreign media hinted that the crisis could be worsened by data corruption within the state's central monitoring system, outdated software unable to track real-time fluctuations. If true, it means that Russia's heating grid isn't just breaking down physically, it's losing coordination digitally. The nation's infrastructure, vast, aging, and tightly centralized, may be collapsing under its own complexity. But perhaps the most revealing signal comes not from engineers or officials, but from the people themselves. In districts where heat remains off, residents have begun organizing informal repair teams, sharing fuel, and insulating basements with improvised materials. The self-reliance emerging from this chaos stands in stark contrast to the government's paralysis. "They told us to wait," says a resident of southern Moscow. "So we stopped waiting." In a country where endurance has long been celebrated as virtue, something quieter but more defiant is beginning to surface, not protest, not yet, but awareness. A realization that the system once seen as unshakable may no longer be capable of protecting anyone. Officially, the crisis remains under control. Unofficially, the balance is slipping. Moscow's administrative centers are still heated, but their corridors echo with anxiety. Insiders whisper that the presidency has demanded a decisive resolution before the week's end, a phrase that sounds less like strategy and more like desperation. The irony, unspoken but felt, is unbearable. The capital that commands a war abroad can no longer guarantee warmth at home. And as night approaches, that contradiction grows colder by the hour, a silence filled with the hiss of leaking steam and the distant hum of generators that never stop. By the late hours of the afternoon, the crisis no longer looked like a chain of malfunctions, it resembled a controlled unraveling. Across Russia's industrial heartland, the pattern was repeating itself with eerie precision: simultaneous pressure failures, ruptured pipelines, and emergency valves freezing shut. Regional authorities spoke of hydraulic instability, but the phrase meant only one thing: the system was collapsing from within. In cities like Samara, Chelyabinsk, and Perm, central heating plants reported total shutdowns, forcing entire districts to go dark. The Ministry of Energy continued to insist that the situation was temporary, yet multiple sources confirmed that emergency fuel reserves meant for peak demand have already been consumed. Replacement shipments are stalled somewhere along the Volga, where frozen waterways and rail bottlenecks have paralyzed logistics. One insider summarized it bluntly: "We are burning through the last safety margin of the state itself." At this stage, the Kremlin's priority shifted from repair to containment, not of heat, but of information. Media outlets received explicit orders to avoid using the words crisis, collapse, or failure. Instead, broadcasts showed images of ministers touring boiler stations, surrounded by cameras and bright lights that masked the frost behind them. Yet, outside the frame, reality seeped through. Videos posted on encrypted channels showed residents lighting bonfires in courtyards, their breath visible against the night. In the industrial city of Tula, a local hospital appealed for portable generators after its internal heating failed. The request was denied on logistical grounds. Across regional administrations, phones went unanswered as mayors struggled to choose between honesty and survival. "No one wants to be the first to admit how deep it goes," said one official from Voronezh. "We're afraid not of punishment, but of exposure." Behind this fear lies a deeper truth: the state's administrative machinery is cracking under the same strain as its pipes. Coordination between ministries has broken down. The Ministry of Industry blames foreign sanctions for the lack of components, the Energy Ministry blames regional mismanagement, governors blame sabotage or unusual frost. But experts know the real cause: chronic neglect and overcentralization. The entire system depends on a handful of outdated control hubs near Moscow, designed for a country that no longer exists. When those hubs fail, every province feels it instantly. "This isn't infrastructure anymore," an energy engineer told us quietly. "It's anatomy, and the body is shutting down." Meanwhile, analysts abroad are watching closely. In European energy circles, the Russian heating crisis is being discussed not only as a humanitarian emergency but as a geopolitical indicator. The same country that once threatened to freeze Europe is now freezing itself. For NATO planners, this marks a subtle but significant shift, a superpower forced to redirect resources inward, its logistical backbone turning brittle under pressure. Yet no one celebrates. There is unease in the observation, because when an empire begins to fracture internally, unpredictability follows. "You can contain an external conflict," said one Western official, "but not the collapse of a system that holds itself together by force." Within Russia, silence grows heavier. Citizens sense that something fundamental has broken, though no one dares to define it aloud. The nightly news still insists that repairs are progressing according to schedule, even as temperatures continue to fall. Between the lines, however, a new phrase appears in bureaucratic memos: non-recoverable sectors. In administrative language, that means places the state can no longer save. Engineers already know what comes next: as the frost deepens, pipes that remain idle will burst beyond repair, condemning entire neighborhoods to months without heat. And with every district lost, the distance between the government's promises and people's lives grows wider. For decades, Russian stability rested on a myth: that no matter the hardship, the center would always hold. Tonight, that myth flickers like the last light in an unheated window. The state still speaks with confidence, but its voice echoes over a landscape of silence and smoke, where citizens are learning to survive without instruction. The great machine that powered a continent is stalling, not from external attack, but from its own exhaustion. And as frost spreads through the country's veins, even those closest to power begin to whisper the question they once dismissed: if the cold can breach Moscow, what else might follow? By evening, Russia stood on the edge of a quiet catastrophe. The hum of the city had faded into the sound of generators, and the glow of apartment windows flickered dimly behind layers of frost. Official channels declared that the situation is stabilizing, yet everyone knew the opposite was true. In hundreds of towns and cities, the heat had simply vanished, and with it, the last illusion of control. What had begun as a technical failure had evolved into something far more profound, a slow, internal unraveling of a system that once seemed unshakable. The state still speaks in the language of management, but on the ground, people are speaking in the language of survival. According to internal briefings shared between ministries, the government has quietly shifted to what it calls selective restoration mode. In practice, that means triage, deciding which districts to save and which to abandon. Strategic sites, government complexes, and military facilities are prioritized, while residential zones are quietly left off the schedule. We're told to restore optics, not warmth, admitted an engineer from the Moscow region. In other words, repairs that can be filmed are completed first, those unseen will wait indefinitely. The logic is brutal but familiar, perception before reality. Yet this time, the gap between the two is widening too fast to conceal. The infrastructure is dying in real time, and every hour of cold brings it closer to collapse. Inside Moscow, the tone of the leadership has changed. Where once there was confidence, there is now quiet anger, directed not at the problem, but at the exposure of it. Emergency meetings continue behind closed doors, with advisors presenting maps shaded in blue, marking unheated districts. Each new blue patch represents another failure, another broken promise. This cannot be shown, one official reportedly said, not even to ourselves. But the images are already spreading online, despite censorship. They reveal a truth no decree can hide: Russia's vaunted energy empire, long presented as the foundation of its strength, is freezing from within. Meanwhile, the human toll deepens. Hospitals ration heat between wings, schools remain shuttered, and families gather in kitchens where gas stoves glow like relics of a vanished comfort. Volunteers distribute blankets and portable burners, often financed by private donors rather than the state. Across the provinces, local radio stations broadcast safety instructions that sound like messages from another century: how to prevent hypothermia indoors, how to insulate windows with plastic, how to survive when the grid fails entirely. The imagery is haunting. A nation that once prided itself on fueling the world now struggles to keep its own people alive through the night. International observers are watching with restrained astonishment. For decades, Russia projected power through its energy exports, oil, gas, pipelines, and leverage. Now, the same system that defined its might has become a symbol of fragility. Economists warn that the heating crisis may soon ripple into other sectors: transport, manufacturing, even defense logistics. When a state this centralized loses heat, one Western analyst noted, it loses coherence. That assessment is spreading even inside Russia, whispered among bureaucrats who no longer believe their own reports. The realization is dawning that the cold is not just a season, it's a verdict. By nightfall, the air over Moscow hung still, heavy with exhaust from portable generators and the smell of burning fuel. The capital's skyline shimmered faintly through the frost, beautiful and brittle, like glass under strain. On television, the narrative remains intact, loyal, measured, unbroken. But in the quiet of unheated apartments, people are beginning to speak differently. They no longer ask when the heat will return, but whether it will return at all. The war that once defined Russia's power abroad has turned inward, consuming the very foundations that sustained it. And as this long day draws to an end, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: the enemy is no longer beyond the border, it's within the pipes, the systems, and the silence that holds them together. This is not the fall of a network, it is the unveiling of what was always there, a state held together by pressure and fear, now cracking under its own frozen weight. The question is no longer whether Russia can restore its heat, but whether it can restore its confidence before the frost becomes permanent. For those watching closely, this is the moment when power meets its reflection, and finds it cold.